Greetings in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, and welcome back to our introduction to the Gospel according to Luke. In this short session, I would like to introduce to you regard to some basic questions as to who wrote the Gospel, when was it written, and for whom was it written, and then see the structure of the Gospel. First of all, we know it is Luke who wrote this Gospel. But who is this Luke? Paul's letter to the Colossians in chapter 4 verse 14 names a certain Luke who is the beloved physician. In the Acts of the Apostles in chapter 16, we have reference to a Luke who is the traveling companion of Paul. And therefore, traditionally, Luke is considered as the author of this Gospel. Luke, who is the traveling companion of Paul, and he receives much of his information through his contact with Paul and the community of Paul. The Gospel is written sometime between 60 and 80 AD. And it is addressed to Theophilus, as we would see in the very first prologue to the Gospel. Theophilus is a name which means someone who loves God. He is Greek, and therefore it is a Gentile audience to which Luke is writing. There are several characteristics of Greek literature in this particular Gospel, and so we know the ambient is more of a Gentile Greek situation rather than a Palestinian Jewish situation. And Luke has tried to explain the life of Jesus that was lived in Palestine to an audience that has no information or experience of Palestine personally. And so he translates this message of Jesus who lived in Palestine to people who are living in a Gentile situation. Let's look at the structure of Luke's Gospel so that we can read it more profitably. And when you read it, look at this structure and how Luke has arranged his material. In fact, right at the beginning, in the first 4 verses, we have the prologue in which he says, I have done a research on many of the things that are already written about Jesus and have made an orderly account for you. And this is the orderly account that he is presenting before Theophilus. And in this orderly account, therefore, he adds a lot of information about the infancy of Jesus, the boyhood years of Jesus, and a preparation for his ministry. And we have that in chapter 1, verse 6 to chapter 4, verse 13. In chapter 4, verse 14 to chapter 9, verse 50, we have a description of the ministry of Jesus in Galilee, like the Gospel according to Mark. But he has lengthened this a little more, giving a little more detail, beginning with the very first sermon that Jesus preached in the synagogue in Nazareth, chapter 4, verse 14 and the following, where he quotes Isaiah and says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to bring good news to the poor. The central section is in chapter 9, verse 51 to chapter 19, verse 27, which is a very long section of almost 11 chapters, where he talks about Jesus' journey to Jerusalem. And Luke would talk about this journey to Jerusalem and describes this as the central event of Jesus' life. And in fact, Luke would mention only one journey of Jesus to Jerusalem. His whole public ministry is a journey to Jerusalem. So it is not a geographical journey, but a theological way of presenting Jesus on his way to Jerusalem, where he would be crucified and where he would bring salvation to everyone. In this journey, which begins in chapter 9, verse 51, when he sets his face resolutely to go to Jerusalem, and in chapter 19, verse 27, where we are at the doors of Jerusalem, we have a lot of teaching about discipleship, where he tells the disciples about the importance of taking up their cross and following, preparing them to understand what's going to take place in Jerusalem, the passion and death of Jesus in Jerusalem. And then we have a section that describes the ministry of Jesus in Jerusalem in chapter 19, verse 28 to chapter 23, verse 56, with his triumphant entry into Jerusalem, the cleansing of the temple, the eschatological discourse that he gives to the disciples and to the people gathered in the temple, and then a description of the Last Supper, the prayer of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, his arrest, his trial, his passion, and his death and his burial. All that concludes in chapter 23, verse 56. In chapter 24, we have again a longer description of the resurrection narratives, unlike in Mark, where he describes the empty tomb. He talks about the various appearances of Jesus, particularly that appearance of Jesus to the two disciples walking to Emmaus, which is the long description, and then his ascension into heaven. With that, he concludes the gospel. So with this structure in mind, I'm sure to read the gospel and understand it better and pray the gospel really, so that the face of Jesus, the heart of Jesus, will be always with you in his compassion and in his mercy, bringing you salvation and great joy. God bless you all.